Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The Ukraine and its bloody internal ructions, the international tug of war involving Cold War sanctions and the hot fibre war of propaganda continues to rage. Truth, as always, is the first casualty.
This week, William Hague provocatively took to the stage again in Kiev, issuing demands, making allegations, and confusing simple terms like democracy and thuggery. In short, when thugs in Kiev overthrow the elected government, set the presidency on fire, and threaten MPs with death unless they agree to rip up the country's constitution, they are democracy protesters.
But when people in the south and east of Ukraine take to the streets in protest against the thuggery in Kiev, well, it's they who are the thugs, and probably Russian thugs to boot. George Orwell, who in his novel 1984 invented the concept of doublespeak, where war is called peace, lies are called truth, and everything becomes the inverse of itself, might well have been envisaging just such an era as today's. Helping us orbit around the Ukraine imbroglio is respected commentator Neil Clark. Neil, welcome back to the Sputnik. William Hague was there on the front line, wagging his little finger once more. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, I think the hypocrisies are really off the scale here, George, from William Hague and from the British government and the US government on this issue. I've written a piece for the RT.com website called "I'm Confused, Can Anyone Help Me?" It was a rhetorical question, but I think that many people around the world will be very confused about what's been going on in the Ukraine, because let's think back to December and January, and we had anti-government protests there. We had people occupying government buildings violently. They were throwing things at the police, throwing Molotov cocktails. And yet we were told by the same William Hague and by John Kerry and the other Western leaders that these people were pro-democracy protesters and that occupying government buildings in the Ukraine was a very good thing. Now we go to April and May and we're told by the very same people that occupying government buildings in the Ukraine is a very bad thing.
It's thuggery.
They're terrorists and they've got to be removed.
Not just removed, of course, but slaughtered. In
yep.
Odessa, a trade union headquarters was set on fire, and between 30 and 40 people were burned to death. Where's the hue and cry?
Absolutely. I was actually travelling home by car on Friday. I was at a family funeral, unfortunately, and I put the BBC Radio 2 News on at about 8 o'clock, and there was no mention of the Ukraine whatsoever. There were lots of stories about Max Clifford and other celebrity stories. Nothing about Ukraine. So I thought, well, hopefully that's a peaceful day in Ukraine. I came back home, put on RT, and I heard about this terrible massacre in Odessa with up to 45 people burned alive. And if they weren't burned alive, they were bludgeoned to death by people with baseball bats as they left on the ground. A quite appalling massacre, and yet the British media didn't want to report on it at first. And in fact, the British politicians, whereas, you know, they've been silent, absolutely silent.
Can you imagine if if the boot had been on the other foot?
Absolutely.
And 40 people had been burned alive, and when they leapt from windows to save themselves from being burned alive, were then bludgeoned to death. If that happened in Iran or if
Venezuela, just imagine in Venezuela with all the hue and cry about human rights in Venezuela.
This would have been the biggest story of them all. Yet it has been completely ignored. Our colleague Seamus Milne on The Guardian, whom we both admire, he had, I think, the seminal piece on this just the other day in The Guardian, worth our viewers looking it up. And he made the point to me when I was congratulating him about the article. He doesn't quite know, even though he's worked his whole lifetime in the media, how this happens. How the media, by some process of osmosis, is turned towards some issues and away from other issues. Can you enlighten us on that?
Well, absolutely. I've been a journalist now for 15, 20 years, and it's the same thing. I think that there's enormous pressure to comply with the official party line, if you like. We're living in basically a one-party state in Britain. Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, etc. It's one party. Ambitious journalists know the line to take. If you're an ambitious careerist journalist in Britain on the left, then you know which way to go. And that is, I think you're allowed to talk about economic issues a little bit, so long as you toe the line.
Domestic issues.
On domestic issues. So you can call for public ownership a bit of the railway, so long as you come out and bash Putin and bash Russia.
So where does this story go now? President Putin's obviously trying to de-escalate the situation. He appealed vainly, it's turned out, to the people in eastern Ukraine not to go ahead immediately with the referendum on autonomy. They've decided to press ahead regardless. There's no sign of any de-escalation on the other side, though.
Not at all. I mean, all the major, since this crisis has begun, all the diplomacy's come from Russia, really. And at every point in this whole crisis, it's been the West who has actually sought to escalate it still further by taking provocative steps all the way since November, really. And so I think it all depends, the ball is in the court of the US. They're the people who have created this in the first place. They were the people who took that decision to violently topple a democratically elected government and create this crisis. And I think that as for the referendums that are going to be held, referendums are the purest form of democracy. And I think that, it's right and proper that people in the East and the South should have their direct say in what happens, whether they want to stay in Ukraine, be part of a more federalized country, or independence is up to them.
We discussed this potential outcome before. I think we were both in agreement that the obvious solution is a federal situation where the East can look east and the West can look west. Why can't the Kiev authorities agree to that?
Well, I think the Western countries who actually supported this coup in the first place, they want the whole of Ukraine. They wanted the whole of Ukraine from the beginning. The eastern Ukraine is the economic powerhouse of the country.
But it would be a bit of a poisoned chalice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, quite.
I mean, you'd be taking a territory that doesn't want you and doesn't want the government in Kiev.
And it's interesting, George, that, right from the very beginning, the Kiev junta have done everything they can to alienate people in the East still further. The very first thing they did was to ban the Russian language, then they reversed the law on Nazi insignia, and then they appointed 2 billionaire oligarchs to be governors. So everything they've done right from the beginning has been to alienate the people in the East and the South, which makes you, wonder what their agenda really is. And, unfortunately, I think the only logical conclusion we can take is the agenda has been to create some sort of crisis to actually make this into a very bloody situation. It's important to realise that elections were due anyway in February 2015. That was the time when the EU elections were held. So why on earth...
This was the deal between the previous president,
this was before that. Then there was the deal which said the elections would be later on this year, by the end of this year. Yeah. But I think the US was very keen to regime change here. So what they could do was to topple Yanukovych and his government, then come in with their people and actually clamp down on democracy. It's very important to understand this whole process is against democracy. The US is acting, as it's done throughout the world, is fighting against democracy in Ukraine. But make no mistake, these won't be fair and free elections. Washington's man will get elected. They'll make sure that the candidate, it's absolutely naive to think that Washington would put at least 5 billion, into toppling the previous government, and then have elections and then bear the risk of having the wrong candidate win.
I thought the US had made an Asia pivot. I thought they were going to be concentrating their efforts much further east. The US economy remains in a very parlous situation. The political strength of the Obama administration is really quite feeble. Yet here they are embarked on a really major and very expensive adventure in Europe.
Well, I think there's various factors why they decided to go for this back in December, why they decided to bring forward their plans here. And I think Syria does come into play. I think there was a strong element of punishing Russia because they effectively blocked. Syria's gone very badly wrong. President Assad should not still be in power. We should have him removed from power by now. We should have had airstrikes on Syria back in August. That was the plan. And Russia, along with public opinion in Western countries, blocked that. And so there was a strong element of punishing Russia for this. The neoconservatives' fingerprints are on this Ukraine operation.
What about the public opinion in the West now regarding the situation in Ukraine? Do you think it will react the same way as it did on Syria?
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating. There's a massive disconnect between the political and media elites on this issue, on Russia and Ukraine generally, and the general public. Because if you pick up your newspaper, you'll see, article after article, Russia-phobic article bashing Putin, the Russian bear is going to invade Finland, all these sort of scare articles, neoconservative, fake left writers. And yet the members of the public don't share this Russophobia. I think there was a poll recently that showed that Israel and other countries were more unpopular in Britain than Russia. there were several countries more unpopular. So it's not working. And I think that's very interesting. It hasn't worked, despite all this enormous energy that's gone into this demonization of Russia, preparing us for this new Cold War. People aren't buying it. People are saying, hey, Ukraine, how come we were backing violent people to topple a democratic government? Why are we siding with neo-Nazis and fascists in Ukraine when we're told in other countries these are bad people? Why are they all of a sudden good people in Ukraine?
These fascists were on the ground in Odessa, weren't they?
Absolutely, they were there, yeah.
It's admitted, isn't it, that
Yes,
they were there.
the right sector were brought in.
The murderers were brought in to do this filthy work.
Yeah, and if you or I had submitted this as a sort of novel or a film script a few years ago, that there would be neo-Nazis coming to power in Europe in 2014, neo-Nazi militia groups would be going there, setting fire to buildings, burning people alive, and that these same neo-Nazis and fascists would be supported by Western leaders, then I'm sure that scenario would have been rejected as fantasy, it's ludicrous, it would never happen. It's happening before our very eyes, George.
Indeed. And the elite tried to persuade us that, well, first of all, they're not actually as Nazi as you say they are, and secondly, they really don't have that much power in Kiev. What's the truth of that?
Well, both are lies, basically. They do have power. They hold key positions in this new junta. The right sector are the sort of stormtroopers of this junta in Ukraine. They're the people who do the dirty work. They're the people who help them come to power in the first place. Because if you had a few thousand people in Maidan, they wouldn't have come to power without violence. So they needed the thugs of the far right to come to power, the people to throw the Molotov
cocktails. They were the cutting edge.
They were the cutting edge. Without them, this would never have happened. And they still needed today to put the boot in on genuine pro-democracy protesters in the East. So we've got this extraordinary double standard that the Western elites who claim to be anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, are actually siding with these people in the Ukraine. And it's absolutely, I think, disgusting that in this week when we commemorate the victory against the Nazis in World War II, that our elites are siding with these people and trying to minimize their crime, trying to gloss over their extremism.
You couldn't make it up. Truth stranger than fiction. Neil Clark, as always, thank you very much. After the break, one of Ireland's finest campaigners and filmmakers joins us to talk about the far too little known Ballymurphy massacre in 1971, when unarmed civilians were slaughtered on the streets by British paratroopers. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Most everybody knows about Bloody Sunday in Derry in the north of Ireland on the 30th of January in 1972, when soldiers of the British Parachute Regiment shot dead 14 unarmed civilian democracy protesters. No less than Prime Minister David Cameron has publicly apologised for the crime, and £100 million expended on a decade-long inquiry was conducted into it.
But almost nobody knows about Belfast Bloody Sunday at the Ballymurphy housing estate, where the very same soldiers had massacred 11 equally unarmed democracy protesters, only 5 months earlier in August of 1971. Last year we visited the site and laid a wreath at the memorial wall at Ballymurphy, but most people in Britain and abroad said they'd never heard of it.
One of the leading campaigners for justice for the slain of Ballymurphy, Sean Murray, is about to release a highly acclaimed film about the events called Ballymurphy, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Sean, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Let's take a quick look at a short clip from your film, which is wonderful, by the way, to see the context.
They're covering it up because they know that they murdered 11 innocent people in cold blood, and they felt they got away with it. They didn't expect us as families, children, to grow up, come into adulthood, and decide that we needed to know the truth.
So then you end up with all sorts of, arguments back and forth. But arguably, if there had been a proper holding to account of those who killed the people in Ballymurphy, then there wouldn't have been a Bloody Sunday. And then there wouldn't have been the huge convulsion and the radicalisation that went on in the relationships between people here and between these two islands. So there's only one trajectory comes out of that, and that is a continuing conflict. And that's the legacy of Ballymurphy. arguably even Bloody Sunday is part of the legacy of Ballymurphy.
It's a chilling thought that if they had been held to account for the mass murder in Ballymurphy, so many more murders could have been avoided. That's at least Gerry Adams' thesis there. 11 people were murdered over 3 days, including a Catholic priest, Father Mullen, and a mother of 8, Joan Connolly, shot several times. Talk us through these dreadful events.
Well, to bring it into a wider context, this was on the morning of interment, whereby an operation, it was Operation Demetrius, was a campaign by the army to round up numerous people from Republican areas, alleged IRA members, and it was a bit of a nonsense from the start. The intelligence was faulty, and 342 people were arrested in Operation Demetrius, and they were mostly arrested under outdated files and were not IRA members at all. So what you had was this volatile situation with a highly armed army going into a small built-up area in Belfast and committing murder on the streets, killing 11 civilians over 3 days. Now this was only in Ballymurphy. There was a wider context to this also, but sticking with Ballymurphy, as you'd mentioned, Father Mullen was killed, and a mother of 8, Joan Connolly.
He went out to try and come to the aid of people who'd already been shot, isn't that right?
That's correct. He was attending to an injured man who was injured in the field. He was clearly, just as in Bloody Sunday, we can remember the iconic images of the priest in Derry holding the white handkerchief. Yes. The same happened in Ballymurphy, only that Father Mullen was shot and killed.
They must have known that he was a priest. Indeed, he'd been on the phone to them telling him he was about to go out.
Absolutely, yeah. He had phoned them just beforehand, and he'd got verification that it was okay to go out into the field. He went out into the field and he was shot dead, yeah.
And Joan Connolly, as I recall, we were there at the wall at the scene of this crime, and her story was particularly devastating. A mother of 8 children, a most unlikely IRA fighter. And she was shot by several different soldiers over actually a relatively lengthy period.
That's right, yeah. I mean, when you look in retrospect, look at the eyewitness testimonies of what happened to Joan Connolly, it's just unbelievable. I mean, where she was shot from was a distance of only yards away, so there was no mistake. I mean, you had different accounts from British soldiers saying that she was a gunwoman. First of all, she had, I think it was an Armalite rifle. The next, she had I think it might have been a Bren gun. So you had different accounts from different soldiers saying that she was, in fact, an IRA gunwoman. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Joan Connolly was out looking for her young children because of the crowds that had gathered on the day of interment.
And they shot her, I think, 3 times, at least, 3 different occasions. They unleashed volleys at her. Clearly, even if she had been a gunwoman, which is absurd in itself, she was clearly of no further danger to anyone. They were out to kill her.
Well, that's correct. Just moving on, even from then, it's just been. We've just received information that it actually seems a bit worse even than what it seems with Joan Connolly. Joan Connolly's legal team, her family's legal team, have recently found out that Joan Connolly was left in a field to die. I mean, she was in fact injured. She was shot in the face, which didn't kill her. She was left for hours. There was a period when the soldiers went into the field and were dragging people out of the field, some dead, some alive. And they had dragged them back into the Henry Taggart barracks, where they proceeded to beat the dead and wounded, even the dead, by eyewitness accounts. And Joan Connolly was left. It was left, and eyewitnesses said that she had been crying out for hours, and this would have been evident to the British soldiers who went into the field.
And these soldiers were paratroopers, the very same regiment, indeed, arguably the very same soldiers who 5 months later committed an even larger mass murder in Derry, isn't that right?
Well, that's correct, George. What exceptionally, what you had involved in Ballymurphy was 3 battalions of the Parachute Regiment. That was 600 soldiers. We now know on the 11th of August came down the mountain road into Ballymurphy, a small, tight-knit area, urban, very, very urban area, where you had 600 Parachute Regiment soldiers shooting at civilians. I mean, it's exceptional to hear. I've never heard of that before. Even in Bloody Sunday, I don't think there were 3 battalions that went into the Bogside that day.
And you are part of a campaigning group that's seeking what exactly now?
Well, we see ourselves as, I myself as a filmmaker sees myself as the only viable medium for families like the Ballymurphy families who have no voice. There's a complete disparity between victims of state violence and victims of IRA violence, whereas institutional media and national broadcasters have always given a voice to those who were affected by IRA violence. It couldn't be further from the truth for victims of state violence, and it's a sort of a huge burden that's been left with filmmakers to deal with. Now, it's not a burden for me. I take great pride in making this film.
The demand for an inquiry, different kind of inquiry to the Bloody Sunday one. We're not talking about 10 years and £100 million. You set up, like the Hillsborough inquiry, or the families did, a panel of worthy people who wanted state backing for an inquiry into these events. What was the government's answer to that?
Well, just last week we had Theresa Villiers, the secretary, the Northern Ireland secretary. She had rejected the request by the families for a Hillsborough model, an independent panel based on the Hillsborough model, with the premise that it was not in the interests of the public.
So she neither offered an alternative to the Hillsborough model?
No, there was no alternative, no. I mean, if we look at the context of the Hillsborough model, what the government had offered the families was the HET, which was the Historical Inquiries Team, which were set up, amongst other things, to investigate army killings in the north of Ireland. Now, from the start, the families did not want anything to do with the HET. They deemed the HET as the state investigating the state. And just last year, we had a damning HMIC report, that's Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, who vindicated the families by saying essentially that the way that these soldiers were being investigated by the Historical Inquiries Team was in fact illegal. So the families were vindicated. They then looked for other means to seek the truth. They didn't want to go down the route, as you had mentioned earlier, about the Bloody Sunday, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, where I think it was 100 million. They didn't want to go down that route. They wanted something that was comprehensive. They looked at the Hillsborough model. 2 main things behind the Hillsborough model were, first of all, it was very cost effective, so they couldn't argue against that. And also, what happened in Hillsborough was that there was a public forum, if you like, where all the evidence that was gathered for Hillsborough could be used for future generations to look at. And no one could deny exactly what happened in Hillsborough, that those people died as a result of negligence. And it's the same in Ballymurphy.
So an event which may well have been seminal, pivotal, vital to decades of conflict in which thousands of people died, remains essentially uninvestigated. And but for your film, unknown to the great majority of members of the public here in Britain and internationally. When's the official launch of the film?
The official launch will be on the 9th of August. That'll be at the West Belfast Festival. That is the 43rd anniversary of the killings in Ballymurphy, so it'll be a pivotal point for the families.
Well, we wish you all the very best with that, Sean.
Thank you.
And
We're
fully behind your campaign. Please give my regards to the families. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks, Gad.
Now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So why are the street activists in Kiev called heroes and in Donetsk called villains? Skinflaker answers that it's the balkanization of Ukraine and the destruction of Russo-EU trade relations. It's US geostrategic and geoenergy politics. And there's an independent blog site called Ukraine Today responding that the real heroes are those peaceful, unarmed protesters who stopped tanks from rolling in and attacking citizens.
Well, I think the United States is the villain in this story. And I do think that Neil Clark is right when he says that what happens next will actually be decided in Washington, not anywhere else. The US has deliberately ramped this whole thing up, expended billions of dollars in it for their own selfish reasons, and they definitely don't have the interests of the people of any part of the Ukraine at heart.
About the Ballymurphy massacre and the rejection of the inquiry into it, Patricia Jones answers that there's too much to hide, no doubt. And Neil Barrington adds to it, saying that they're terrified of the truth over this. Plus, there are many other instances of collusion. And that's it for this week.
Which unfortunately means that's the end of the show.
Do please keep in touch with us on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik, and you can like us on Facebook at Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.